Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, I would like to thank all members who participated in this debate. After all that has been said, I think it is quite clear that there is no disagreement on the importance of multiracial representation in Parliament. Where we differ is simply on how to achieve that multiracial representation. I disagree with Minister Chan when he said that our proposals do not ensure multiracial representation or prevent race-based parties. Earlier on, when I spoke about proportional representation, I mentioned this only briefly. Perhaps that could be the reason why it was not clearly conveyed. So let me go into further details now. Typically in a hybrid electoral system, which is the one that we suggested, containing both elements of first past the post and proportional representation, each voter has 2 ballots instead of 1. The first ballot is to vote for a candidate in a local SMC, and the candidate with the most votes is elected. So this should address the Honourable Member Raj Joshua Thomas' concern about the geographical link between MPs and their residents. Now, the second ballot will then be to vote for a party at the national level. And the seats are allocated to each party based on their national vote share. Each party typically has a party list of the candidates. So if a party is allocated 10 seats, usually the first 10 candidates on the party list gets elected. But I'm not suggesting that we copy wholesale the system that is in place in other countries, unlike what Minister Chan is suggesting. I'm suggesting that we adapt such a system to meet our needs. So how can we adapt this to ensure minority representation? Currently, we have 17 GRCs in total, and up to 3 in 5 must have a Malay candidate, while the other 2 must be Indian or others. This means that the GRC system currently ensures about 12% Malay and 6% Indians and others representation. We can therefore ensure minority representation by mandating that at least 50%, 12%, and 6% of each political party's candidates running in SMCs must be from the Chinese, Malay, and Indian or other communities, respectively. This is analogous to the ethnic integration program in ethnic quota in HDB flats. And secondly, we can also mandate that each party list must be multiracial, and the selection of the candidates from the party list must be chosen in such a manner as to meet the racial representation requirements for each party, as I have mentioned earlier. These requirements can be limited to only parties that contest in more than 1 seat. This is to make room for independent candidates in our electoral system. So by imposing these racial quotas, similar to the way it is done in HDB flats, we can ensure that parties are multiracial and they don't play race-based politics. Another comment earlier about proportional representation is the fear of fragmented parliament. Now, a common feature in proportional representation is actually a threshold. Only political parties that obtain a minimum national vote percentage are allocated seats proportionally. This feature serves to screen out parties with extreme positions and insufficient electoral support that prevents Parliament from getting too fragmented. A common range for thresholds in countries that practice the proportional representation system is around 4 to 5%. The ballot on party lists is like a national-level, multi-cornered fight with participation from all the political parties that wish to contest. If the results of past multi-cornered fights in Singapore election is any guide, we are unlikely to see too fragmented a parliament. Minister Chan earlier mentioned that the fear is that a proportional representation system would result in race-based politics and also parties that run on minority interests. Now, I've addressed the point about race-based politics, and now on the minority interests. I do not see that that is necessarily a bad thing. For there to be parties with minority interests. For example, Green parties have always had some minority support. Environmental concerns have now become mainstream, but Green parties still face great difficulties in winning elections under a first-past-the-post system. So incorporating some level of proportional representation into our electoral system will ensure that minority concerns are also represented, and that can only be beneficial to our decision-making. When a political party enjoys clear majority support, a first-past-the-post system tends to give that party more seats in parliament than its national vote share. We see this clearly in Singapore. As I've mentioned before, PAP gets about 60% of the national vote, but nearly 90% of the elected seats. But when political support is more divided, the outcome becomes more volatile. As an illustration, consider the other side of the coin. If 60% national vote share translate into 90% seats, that means that a national vote share of 40% can result in only 10% of the votes, 10% of the seats. In other words, a drop of 20% in national support level can result in a drop of 80% in seats. Of course, national support level does not normally drop 20% that quickly or that easily. This illustration merely seeks to point out that the volatility and unpredictability of election outcomes under the first-past-the-post system when support level hovers around 50%. At this stage, a proportional representation system actually brings greater stability and predictability. Next, I will move on to the issues relating to the NCMP suggestion. Now, as I've mentioned before, we are confident that our minority candidates can stand on their own and win elections, but because we also recognize the importance, we agree with the importance of multiracial representation in Parliament. That is why we also proposed two alternatives to ensure that. The beauty of the NCMP scheme is that it does not kick in when it's not needed. But if it is needed, if not enough minority candidates can win on their own, then we need to know why and address the underlying issues head-on instead of sweeping it under the GRC carpet. Racism exists in all spheres, not only in elections. And at this point, I actually have a question to ask of Minister Chan. I did not quite understand why he said that if we adopt this scheme, that all the NCMPs, the minorities will be NCMPs in opposition, and the ruling party will be majority Chinese, because under this NCMP scheme, I mean, the NCMP can be in either party, whether it's the ruling party or opposition, unlike the current NCMP scheme, which is just for opposition. Now, Mr. Murali also weighed in on his personal experience, citing examples of the kind of experience he had running his campaign and experiencing attempts by people to exploit the race card. But I think that, like I said, racism does exist. I think we all recognize that, and to totally eradicate it is probably not practical, even though we would all try our best to minimize that as far as possible. But I think the point is that they did not succeed, even though they tried to play the race card. So even though racism does exist, but it is not to the extent that it actually affects election outcomes. The Honourable Member Janet Ang mentioned that a article or report from IPS, I think, in 2013 about the fact that opposition parties also similarly benefit from GRCs. That was after Workers' Party managed to win Aljunied GRC, and I think Minister Chan similarly made the point as well that Workers' Party and PSP also benefited from the coattail effect, and specifically that I also benefited from it. I think the question here is whether GRC is the right way and the best way for Singapore, and not whether I personally benefit from it. Yeah. So the thing is, the doubt is raised by Ms. Janet Ang over the opposition's claim that GRC has a detrimental effect on opposition. So allow me to quote statistics from our GEs around the time when the legislation was changed to introduce the GRC and to make further amendments to it. As I mentioned earlier, it was done over 3 amendments in 1988, 1991, and 1996. So to recap briefly, in 88, 3-member GRCs introduced, justified on the basis of minority representation. 91 and 97, the sizes of GRCs were increased, and the total number of GRC seats, the upper limit was increased. Let's look at the effect these amendments have on our minority representation and political development in the general elections following these changes, which is GE 88, GE 91, and GE 97. Okay, now first we look at minority representation. In GE 84, before the introduction of GRCs, 16 minority MPs were elected, making up 20.3% of all elected MPs. After the introduction of GRC in GE 1988, minority MPs make up 19.8% of all elected MPs, a slight drop compared to GE 1984. In the next 2 GEs, minority MPs make up 21% and 22.9% respectively. In contrast, its effect on our political development is more dramatic. In GE 84, before the introduction of GRCs, 38% of the seats were uncontested. In GE 88, the percentage of uncontested seats dropped to 13.6%. However, in the next 2 GEs, after the GRC sizes were further increased, uncontested seats jumped from 13.6% to 50.6% and 56.6% in GE 91 and 97 respectively. So after 3 amendments, the real effect of the GRC system is this. It made hardly any difference to minority representation, but led to a huge increase in walkovers. Faced with raised hurdles, which is the GRC, opposition parties had to adopt a by-election strategy in response. Looking at these figures, it behoves us to revisit these questions. 1, why were GRCs introduced? Was it truly for minority representation, or was it for political advantage? It is worth noting that in GE 2020, without any further intervention to help minority candidates, the percentage of elected MPs who are minorities has increased to 28%. This happened naturally as part of society's development, similar to the way women representation in Parliament increased to 30% without any GRC-like intervention. 2, why were the maximum sizes of GRCs increased to 6? This does not help minority representation. The justification that this is done so that we need not change the boundaries so frequently is unconvincing. I'm sure we've all heard jokes about how residents keep changing constituencies at each election without moving house. Was it for economies of scale? Wouldn't the same be achieved by a few SMCs working together? 3, why would the upper limit on GRC seats increase? Is it a coincidence that as these changes were made, the number of walkovers increased dramatically? In the recent GE, PAP has tried to make the GRCs smaller. 6-member GRCs were removed, and the average size of GRCs were reduced slightly. However, as long as GRCs remain, so too remain the problems associated with the GRC system, namely coattail effect, reduced voter influence on outcome, hampering political development, and underserved and underrepresented residents in GRCs with unfilled vacancies. The PAP has mentioned before that even though there is a vacancy in the GRC, but residents are happy with the arrangements that they have made for the other MPs to cover the duties of the MP who has left. But in fact, residents have never been directly asked if they preferred a GRC or SMC system. If the PAP is certain of this, would it be willing to ask this question of voters using the presidential election as the means to conduct a referendum? I'm sure this is a question that many Singaporeans would want a say in. Who better to decide how voters should be represented than the voters themselves? Minister Chan earlier spoke about the by-election and concluded by saying that the court has decided. Now, considering that Parliament is the lawmaker and the court executes the laws made by Parliament, I think this rather puts the cart before the horse. In the past, Singapore has benefited from a strong single-party system. At our developmental stages, many countries were ahead of us in development and provided us many examples with which to study. We could emulate where appropriate and discard where not. We could move ahead swiftly with strong political leadership. However, without the regular turnover of leadership and political competition, single-party system also carries the risk of entrenching power within a small group. This can erode democratic principles and perpetuate a culture of nepotism or cronyism. Checks and balances are necessary for the longer term. Singapore has entered a different stage of development, and with each GE, the growing desire of the voters for greater checks and balances and political diversity becomes more apparent. As we move towards a more balanced political landscape, many changes will be needed. One of these is to abolish the GRC. I urge all members and Singaporeans to support the call to abolish GRC and consider alternative ways of ensuring minority representation. Thank you.